All right, hey everybody. I know a lot of people missed class today, and those of you that were there realized really early that we were dealing with a really difficult topic. So I wanted to quickly cover some of the stuff we talked about in class for those that weren't there, add a little bit of what we missed for those that were there and we didn't get to as much as we might have wanted to, and try to be really brief about re-presenting this idea of free will and what Sam Harris is really trying to get at. So, of course, we ended last week talking about what thug life meant, and we're watching some Tupac videos this week. And we're still talking about prison and how we go about punishing people. So, remember, we live in a country where right now we have a justice system that's focused on revenge and retribution. You do something, and we assume that you had free will to do it, and we punish you according to what you've done. And we have very little room to rethink that justice system as it currently is designed to start considering how might we reshape it to prevent crimes as opposed to waiting until after they happen and then having victims that deal with trauma and loss for the rest of their life and incarcerated people who are being punished. How could we start to rethink justice and just prevent the crimes if that's possible? And this is a doorway in. When we start to realize why people do different math than you and I do, why do some people struggle with temptations to hurt others or to victimize others when many of us never struggle with that temptation? Or when we do, we quickly can overcome it and say, no, 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 I have lots of good reasons to not do it. And it turns out the closer we looked in class and in the podcast assigned, we've discovered that actually free will is really hard to find. If you really look close, you'll notice that all of the weights you put on the values of different choices, they all come from past experiences. If you think back on something you used to act or believe one thing about and you've since changed your mind, you can pinpoint where that change came from, and it always came from experience. It always came from somebody talking to you about something that you reconsidered, or an article you read, or a TV show you had, or an experience out in the world. And even if you can't remember the specifics of why you make some choices, they only come from experience. That's what the neurology says. That's what Sam Harris says. So in class, we played with this idea, trolley problem. The trolley is going to kill 5 people, and you're standing at a lever that can switch it to kill just one. And we really dug deep into how do you feel about this? And we discovered that people actually felt a little different based on whether or not you were omitting an act and not pulling the lever and killing 5 people, and committing an act and actively pulling a lever, even though you might be saving 5 lives, you would then be killing. And then we started to play with this a little bit and say, yeah, but what if it was a baby versus 5 adults? What if it was 5 babies versus 1 baby? And we could change the math. We could realize in some of these scenarios, we would be much more likely to pull the lever or not pull the lever, even though a huge sum of people, considering this bottom picture, there's literally tens of thousands of supporters of the Nazi regime in the 1940s. We would literally be killing all of them. But in our minds, the math is different when what's on top is somebody important to us, especially if it's somebody important to us. And we played with this a lot of different ways in class, right? If you could kill these different people, which one would you value the most? So what we're trying to do, we actually played with the same scenario and we took it out of human brains, which we tend to still feel like have free will, and we plugged it into a car brain. And we explained how a lot of these decisions are already being made in automobiles. They have to be because they're self-driving, and we're to the point now where a car can tell the difference between a van that appears to have 5 bodies in it that are small, like children, and a small compact car that appears to have 2 bodies in it, and it has no choice but to make some sort of decision. So now as humans operating on that same logic that informs all our other decisions, we're programming up cars to make moral decisions without first having a conversation about morality and how to make those decisions. So back to free will, because this was really the meat of today's discussion. We put it in conversation with our Tuesday readings about brain hemispheric difference, and we realized free will resides largely in the left hemisphere because the left hemisphere insists on having a story to explain everything. But free will, even though it's really hard to find where it exists because all of our decisions, all of our considerations about what's important to us and what's not, what temptations we have, and why we think we might want to push back against them, they always and only come from past experience. And yet free will is the undergirding criminal principle of our criminal justice system. So we only punish people based on this faulty notion that if I was in that situation, I would have done something different. They should have done something different. Whereas in reality, if you wound the universe back in time, you set everything exactly how it was. It doesn't matter how far back we go to a decision you made 20 years ago or one you made last week. And if everything in the universe, your memories, your neurology, your genetics, the position you're in, what you had for breakfast, the experiences you haven't had yet, the books and TV shows you've watched, they're all the same. You will make the exact same decision. There's nowhere in that scenario to add an extra piece that would make you choose differently. And yet we constantly think of free will as this idea that I could have done differently if I could go back in time. Now, of course, Sam adds this one piece that if you're thinking adding a soul to the mix gets us off the hook because I can just say free will lives there, he also explains that this doesn't really change anything because you're still just adding an extra piece to the puzzle, and presumably the soul works the same way as the brain does. So if free will is not in the brain, we still have to then go to the soul and explain how does the soul of some people value death or violence or stealing, and the souls of other people value good things, empathy, taking care of one another. And it always goes back to the experiences that that soul has had in the past. Now, in the video you were assigned to watch, Sam plays with this with the idea of pick a city, any city. And we did this in class. If you haven't watched that video, I encourage you to make sure you watch through to the section where he does this experiment. But it's what he's trying to get at with free will. He's not saying that people shouldn't be held accountable. He's not saying that people don't have agency, but he's pointing out that all of our decisions, beliefs, ideas, understandings of the world, they are only and always based on our experiences, and they're never based on experiences we haven't had. We have a really hard time noticing the things that we don't know. So this isn't a call to let people out of prison. He's suggesting that if a hurricane blew through an area and killed a bunch of people that were special to us and that we loved, we wouldn't dream of hunting down the hurricane and trying to lock it up just to punish it, because we don't see hurricanes as having free will and conscious experience where they deliberately did it. And yet when we look at humans that do awful things, we think about them as having free will. We want to lock them up and throw away the key. And then we can play with some in-betweens. Like, well, what if a human does a terrible thing? We're mad at them, but then we find out they had a huge brain tumor that was impacting their decision-making ability. We all suddenly feel a little bit better. And indeed, we found out today that you can even do things as simple as give somebody a warm beverage when they're going into a group situation, and they'll be more likely to cooperate. We found out you can put somebody in a room full of nasty smelling garbage and then give them a quiz about where their political stances are. And if it stinks in there, they will vote more conservatively. If it smells like roses and petunias or fresh baked bread, they'll vote more liberally. But none of these things happen in our conscious experience. And our brains will actually fabricate stories that are not true to explain why we voted more conservatively that morning, because we won't realize it's because of the bad smell. We want free will. We don't want to think a bad smell could manipulate us. And on the flip side, stick your hand in some cold water and it does the same experience backwards. And imagine the desperation that shows up the longer you keep your hand in cold water. You can't just choose not to experience it that way, and yet it's informing what you're going to do next, even if you're fighting against it. So again, Sam uses a couple examples. The brain that lets me stay on my diet is just as mysterious as the brain that allows me, or that forces me or tricks me into eating cherry pie for breakfast. No matter what's going on with the decisions we make that often feel like they're freely made, they're always mysterious. And we might better say that I was just in a really good position to see the decision made, but I don't really know why I make most of the decisions I make. Of course, this is also in Sam's thing. He disassembles the distinction between things like reason and emotion. Often, if we ask a question to a group of people, like Jonathan Haidt did when he presented the example of a brother and a sister having a sexual relationship, how do we feel about this? And we all responded with emotions. No, this is bad. We shouldn't allow it. But when asked to provide legitimate reasons, most of us really struggled to come up with reasons that stood. We thought we had come up with a good reason to start with, and it turns out that our emotion was driving our reason, and often our reasoning process, our logic, drives our emotions. You can think also, just to sort of broaden this discussion a little bit, Ducks follow the first creature that they see after they hatch. It's called imprinting, and this is an evolutionary advantage that makes them much more likely to survive just because they're likely to be around a much larger creature if a predator wants to come in and eat them, and they're likely to be in a group because they're all following. But sometimes this means they actually follow dogs or humans. There's tons of cool videos online of little ducklings following people around. So the point here is from the perspective of the duck. If you could ask a duckling, why are you following this dog? We can presume that they would come up with a fabulous answer. And it wouldn't be true, but if they were human, they would insist, oh no, it's because I like this dog. This dog adopted me. It's because they were wired up from the start to follow the first thing they see. So again, with the connection, doubt and discuss. We already talked about conservatism, awful smells, how you can mess with people's emotions by just changing the environment around them. And in class, we really dug through the evolutionary roots of this connection between disgust and otherness, seeing people or things that come across as threats, and we feel disgusted by them. Hate or love, they often feel like opposites, but it's another interesting piece to consider. To really hate something truly, you have to understand a lot about it, just like you do to love. And often to criticize, you also have to know something really well in a way that actually comes across as love. So again, we picked apart a lot of these things that feel like they're separate and they feel like they're where free will might live. Trauma and logic. Anybody that's been through a traumatic experience like prison or like an abusive relationship or some sort of assault has times in their life when those emotions and feelings show back up. And as much as we'd like to say we freely choose our decisions in those moments, they inevitably impact us, and we can't not be impacted when it happens. And yet again, it's always based on the past. And it always feels separate. Trauma and logic feel like two different things. In one human body, they're the same thing. So as we keep picking at free will, don't overthink it. His point isn't to say nobody makes any choices ever. His point is to say it's nowhere near as simple as everybody making the same decisions from the same set of base facts and values and doing the same calculations on how good and bad different decisions are. We're all bringing different math to the table. We all value everything differently. We all have different goals and ambitions. We all have different likes and dislikes. And they all go back to experience. We didn't choose any of them before we were born. So let's talk more about this next week. Sorry that went a little longer than I'd like. Do with it what you will.